Hey everyone, I hope you're all doing well tonight in this what is a crazy landscape at the moment. Anyone who's tuned in is really kind of keeping the faith and along with the Rare Book School doing stuff that really is somewhat outside of probably a lot of people's thought processes right now. But this is the third and last in our bit of a series on Mesoamerican manuscripts and maps. And tonight we're going to take a little different tact. This talk tonight and our seminar tonight is going to talk a little bit about actually the makeup and materials that make up some of the manuscripts that we've talked about so far. And then go into the complex history of the Huexotzinco Codex, which is one of the great treasures of the Library of Congress, as you will see in just a little bit. The Huexotzinco Codex kind of has everything going for it. It's an extremely rare Mesoamerican codex. It is a beautiful piece of art. It's made of a mate, the paper, the traditional Mexican paper. It has a court case involving Cortez. And it has all kinds of intrigue and lots of cash being exchanged and lots of tribute being stolen. So it's kind of one of those great pieces that kind of has everything going for it as a world treasure. So we're going to start by kind of talking about paper and talking about plants. And really, the manuscript of the Huexotzinco Codex, much like the Oztoticpac Lands Map that we talked about in our first session, is made of a mate. And a mate is kind of a sort of a basket term in a way. We're going to talk a little bit about and a lot about the plants that kind of make up that basket term. We're talking about things like mulberry trees. We're talking about fig trees. That are native to Mexico, South America, South United States. And we're going to kind of talk about them in a little bit of detail, just because it's kind of an interesting ethnobotanical question of exactly what particular species and what kind of plants and fibers are being used to make up these manuscripts, to make these manuscripts. So we're going to start out that way, and then we're going to go into the actual Huexotzinco Codex. Which is has a complex history, an amazing provenance, and really is one of the great treasures of the library. So when we start talking about this, we're going to begin talking about the fig tree. And this is the Ficus genera. For quite some time now, I've been, as you have seen in the last two seminars here, we've talked a lot about plants. We've kind of focused a great deal on some of the plants and ethnobotanical information on the Oztoticpac Lands Map and also on the Codex Quetzalecatzin. And tonight we're going to do a little bit different because we're going to really be talking about the materials as opposed to what's actually shown on the map, on the manuscript itself. We're going to actually talk about what it's made of. And there are a number of ficus species. The ficus genus is the fig genus. And the ficus genus, there's a whole slew of them that are found in Mesoamerica and in Mexico that have been used to make paper. Some of them are rather large. You can see here, this is the Ficus cotinifolia. And just take a look when you're looking through this, and as we go through this, kind of take a look at the difference in the leaves. All of the ficus trees that we're going to talk about that are used in paper making and that may have been used in some of the manuscripts that we're going to be talking about, and many of the Mesoamerican manuscripts that survive, both in the Nahuatl sense that we're talking about tonight, but also Maya manuscripts, which are also made on fig bark paper or mulberry bark paper. So this is the first one we're just going to take a brief look at. I've been involved in a rather complex and long research program on looking at the various ficus species that have been used in paper making in Mesoamerica. Scholars tend to generalize a little bit when they're talking about these things. Our hope is to actually get down to kind of the species level ideas about what is actually being used in these manuscripts. So this is just one of many, and we're going to talk about a group of them. You can see these have these sort of oval leaves. Other ficus species, this is the one called the rock fig, and this is a very important one, and we're going to be looking at this one in a little bit more detail. You can see the leaf structure is very, very different. This one is talked about quite extensively in Francisco Hernandez's book that we've talked about several times in all of the sessions that we've done so far. It's also used medicinally. And so many of the ficus trees are used medicinally, as are the mulberry trees. So these things have kind of dual uses in an ethnobotanical sense. They're both used to kind of build up paper and other things, other fibrous things like ropes and things like that. And they're also used in a medicinal way. Hernandez in particular talks about this one. Basically, you cook the roots in order to relieve the pain of fever and chest pain. There's a real complicated ethnobotany surrounding all of the ficus species that are found in Mesoamerica. This particular one called the rock fig, we'll kind of look at in a little bit more detail in just a bit. That idea of rock fig is a really important common name. That you'll see in just a bit is kind of reflected in a lot of the manuscripts that we're going to look at in relation to the Codex, the Huexotzinco Codex. Another ficus species, again, the leaf is very, very different. This one also used in papermaking. The ficus species are not really well known exactly which species is used in many of the older Mesoamerican codices that are on amate, that are on fig bark paper. There are several programs looking at using ancient DNA to try and extract some of the DNA from some of the fibers of some of these manuscripts and compare them to some of the DNA sequencing that's been done. But to a certain extent, we don't really know which particular species is being used. We know that the genus, at the genus level, but there are at least 200 species and subspecies of fig and mulberry that exist in the Mesoamerican range. And so which trees are actually being used and which ones are being used today, obviously we know, but the ones that are being used historically in some of the manuscripts that we've looked at is still kind of an open question. We talked about that rock fig just a little bit ago, and we can see that it appears in a number of manuscripts. This is the Bandianus manuscript, and we can see that basically this is called the yellow paper tree of the boulders, this particular species that we just looked at. And we can see here there's, in the manuscript, there's a rock glyph showing that the fig tree is actually growing on rocks. And in Hernandez's book on the plants of Mesoamerica from 1651, he called this either yellow paper or mountain paper. In other words, he did understand that this particular plant was being used as a paper-making plant. Most of the paper that comes from this particular species of plant is kind of darkish, as you see up here in the right-hand corner. That's an example of the paper that's made from this particular species. He talked about it in real detail, and we have a lot to thank him basically giving us a real precise idea of what this particular paper-making species and what this particular paper-making tree was used for. Hernandez actually illustrates the plant in his book, and he talks about it here as both a, as he said, yellow paper plant and mountain paper plant. And he basically describes, what in fact and how it was used. And so while we don't have, as I said, a lot of precise information on which particular species of ficus was used to make amate. We obviously have the sort of anthropological information that we're getting today, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. But also Hernandez's and several other sources, like the Badianas manuscript that I just showed, that are kind of giving us an idea that we can focus in on several important species, including this one here. Now, also, there's a couple of other plants that are used to make paper in Mesoamerica. This is called the nettle tree. Nettles are also used to make paper. So we have both the ficus or the fig family, the genus, and we also have the nettle family, which is used quite extensively to make paper. As I said, I've been going through over the last few years a rather extensive botanical survey of the earliest collecting of these particular plants and mentioning of paper making being made out of them. And so spending a lot of time in these herbariums looking for the earliest samples that are collected. The range of some of these plants will give us some information if we could identify this to the species level or even to the general level in certain senses based on the fact that we know what the range of some of these plants are. It would give us a good sense of where the paper was made, which is still a very open question when one is talking about Mesoamerican manuscripts in general, not only the Nahuatl manuscripts that we've been talking about, but also Maya manuscripts and Maya books that survive. So nettles are used extensively, not only the trees, but actually the nettle plant can be used to make paper. And there's a great many of these that exist in the range that we're talking about in the area around Huexotzinco and the area in the Mexican ranges of Oaxaca that exists quite prevalently. There are instances of these particular nettle plants also being used to make paper. And so again, we have a whole range of these kind of plants, not only the ficus, but also the nettle species that are used to make paper in Mesoamerica that also appear in historical books. The one that we're going to concentrate on a little bit tonight is the Morris species. And this is a really interesting and important plant. This is a mulberry family plant. Morris is the mulberry genus. This particular plant yields a much lighter colored paper, as you can see on the left-hand side. Now, in today's world, much of the white paper that we see, the amate that's being made today, is bleached. Whereas in a historical sense, some of the earlier papers that are white and that are very light colored actually come from the mulberry family as opposed to the ficus family. And so when we're looking at we'll actually see some of the pages from that particular work, you'll get a sense that the paper is very light, it's very bright. And the age of the paper, the Huexotzinco Codex dates from around 1531, so an extremely early manuscript from the Nahuatl and Mesoamerican world. The paper that it's on is extremely beautiful, extremely well done, and extremely thin, but very white, and is from the Morris genus. There's a whole slew of subspecies of this particular plant, which are also used in paper making now. And again, the actual species of the plant that is in the Huexotzinco Codex is unknown at this point. We have not been able to identify it to the species level, although it does appear to be the Morris genus. There's a project going on right now, which I am part of, also in places like Kew Gardens, where we're working on actual relationship between the ficus and the Morris species and looking at the sort of the genome of these plants in the hopes that there might be some possibility of actually figuring out what the species that are used in some of the manuscripts are. But it's a long way off, and we are working on it currently. But still, at this point, no one really knows. We have the genuses, and the three big genuses of the nettles, the fig, and the mulberry that are used for paper, and they can be identified using microscopy fairly well to the genus level, but it really would be interesting to sort of see the regional variations in the subspecies of these trees that are actually being used to make paper in some of these historic manuscripts. Now, of course, the way this is made is fairly straightforward. The bark is stripped from the tree, and the inner bark is then typically put in water and boiled. It makes it very, very pliable. It is then used as with a paper beater and made into paper, and then dried in the sun. This is still, of course, being done throughout certain regions of Mexico. There are some very important paper making centers that are still doing this kind of work, and if you travel and actually watch it being made. So it's still something that's being done today in very much the same way it was done in the past, although there have been some chemicals introduced into the process like dyes and bleaches and things like that, which are a little bit different and speed up the process a little bit from what might have been the traditional processes in the 16th century. There's also another plant that's used quite extensively for paper making, and that's agave. We talked about agave because on the Quetzalecatzin manuscript and also on the Oztoticpac Lands Map, there are pictures of agave and samples of agave. Agave plants being used as boundary markers, and agave plants also being used as locations. Agave was an extremely important fiber for making rope and paper and various other fibrous things. The ethnobotany of agave is an extremely complicated thing coming down from California all the way down into Mesoamerica. Recently, myself and Tana Vilfana, who's a scientist at the Library of Congress, worked on a project attempting to identify agave rope and agave fiber in a bead. This is an Olmec bead that you see on the left-hand side here, which strangely enough was found in archaeological context with this little piece of fiber sticking in it. And basically we did some extremely high magnification SEMs, scanning electron microscopy on the bead itself, and we're able to identify the fiber that's actually in it as agave. So agave is also another important plant that is used to make these kinds of manuscripts and the paper that goes in them. So we've got really 4 genuses of plant, wide genuses of plant that basically go into making things like the Oztoticpac Lands Map and the Huexotzinco Codex that we're going to talk about today. So let's talk about the Huexotzinco Codex itself. So the provenance of the Huexotzinco Codex is really, and what it was used for, it's a lawsuit in which Hernando Cortez brings against 3 people, Nuño de Guzman, Juan Ortiz de Mentenzio, and Diego Delgado in 1531, 1532. The manuscript contains indigenous testimony covering 79 pages in Spanish text and includes 8 important drawings on a mate, the kind of paper that we've just been talking about, written in Nahuatl hieroglyphs. Now, the 79 pages of Spanish text are extremely important, and we're going to just look at a little bit of those after we kind of talk about the provenance of the manuscript itself. And I'm actually going to read a little bit of the Spanish text because I think it's important to get a sense of what these manuscripts are and how important they were in order to kind of draw the fact that they were painted on these beautiful pieces of amate, paper that was made in a really beautiful way. This is, as I said, extremely beautiful, well-preserved paper. And we have these paintings, which are basically about a lawsuit and about tribute and about the theft of certain monies and other things from local peoples in Huexotzinco. So the provenance of this manuscript is kind of related in a deep way to what it was used for. So in early Spanish courts, it was very different from the way we would consider a court now. When civil charges were brought against someone, the plaintiff would develop a questionnaire and basically send this to witnesses. And basically, the witnesses would fill out the questionnaire, answering the questions without any of the defendants present. And then the answers from those witnesses would then be compiled by scribes and sent to the defendants, who then would devise their own questionnaire that would be sent to their witnesses. And then after that was done, these two sets of documents would be presented to a court who would render a decision. And the codex that we have, the Huexotzinco Codex that we're talking about tonight, is fragmentary because it only contains the questionnaire and answers to Cortez's side of the story. And really what this is Cortez is bringing a lawsuit against some of the Spanish overseers of a town and a region that he was allies with during the early parts of the conquest and became part of his lands after that took place. And so there were certain rights granted to these peoples. There were certain tributes that were supposed to come to Cortez and to the crown. And the three people who are mentioned in the lawsuit violated those trusts, and hence this lawsuit is about recovering damages and recovering monies based on what Cortez's witnesses say. Now, the manuscript itself has a complicated provenance, and it was kept in the Hospital of the Immaculate Conception in Mexico City, along with lots of other Cortez manuscripts that were kept there for many, many years. They passed as legacies to Cortez's direct descendants, who are the Italian Dukes of Monteleone. And the Italian Dukes of Monteleone kept the documents in the hospital, in the convent, basically, of the Immaculate Conception. And they would give access to those documents as an archive occasionally. They were seen by a Mexican historian, Lucas Alamán, in the early 19th century, and he described many of them. And they remained in that hands until 1927, when Edward Stephen Harkness acquired them through A.S.W. Rosenbach. A.S.W. Rosenbach is, of course, a famous book dealer in the 1920s. Those of you who know anything about the library, the Rosenwald collection, which is one of the larger rare book collections at the library. And it really is not known exactly how the circumstances took place and how he acquired it. The Mexican government acquired the remainder of the archive much later. Harkness is probably best known. He bought the tomb of Perneb. The tomb of Perneb was the big, incredible tomb that he then donated as a whole thing. It's an Egyptian tomb from the 12th dynasty, Middle Kingdom Egypt, which went to the Metropolitan Museum of Art. And if you go to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, you can still see it sitting there whole. He also donated the William the hippo, which is the sort of mascot of the Metropolitan Museum of Art that you see down on the bottom there. Now, the codex itself is the thing we're going to talk about is really the paintings, and there are 8 of them. And to a certain extent, they are beautiful pieces of amate paper were then painted with these incredible Nahua hieroglyphics and Nahua numbers. And really what this is all about in a sense, is this court case. And so what I'm going to do is I'm just going to read a little piece of this court case just to give you a sense of what it's about. As I said, there's a document which is a questionnaire, and the questionnaire is given to various witnesses to what happened in the court case in order to draw out their actual eyewitness testimony. The 79 pages of Spanish text contain a translation of Nahuatl testimony, which was basically written down by an interpreter. So in the one sense, I'm going to just read a little bit, for instance, the question. One of the questions, which is question 4, says whether a witness knows or has seen that the 3 people mentioned, as soon as they arrived in the city, they summoned the lords and leading men of the town and asked that they give and bring a certain quantity, more than 6,000 pesos, of gold and ingots and jewels, and also stones and feathers and clothing, and slaves in an amount worth more than another 1,000 pesos. And let the witnesses say what gold, stones, feathers, clothing, slaves, and other things they gave to the said people immediately upon their arrival and on the road before they arrived in the city. So question 4 is basically saying really what happened, that these 3 men arrive and they ask for the people of the city to begin giving them tribute, which they are in fact not entitled to. This is a really important thing, because what happens in the rest of the Codex is that we have testimony from several indigenous peoples. One of them is named Lucas in the actual manuscript. His name was not originally Lucas, but his Nahuatl name is Teman Volt Etel. And basically what it says is that he was a high citizen of Huexotzinco, and that he will give sworn legal testimony about what actually happened in this case. And basically what he's basically going to talk about is all of the things that are in the various pieces of manuscript that we see. And he's going to, when these 3 arrived in the city, that they demanded certain things from the citizens of the city. And all of the texts that we see, all of the manuscript pieces that we see, basically talk about this. So when we're looking at the hieroglyphs here, we can see there's 7 by 400 loads of cloth, 7 by 20 turkeys, 2 by 8,000 chili peppers. We're not really sure what some of these are. 7 by 400 loads of maize. And this basically continues through the manuscript. 8 by 400 loads of cloth, and then kind of a repeat of some of the turkeys and some of the other things. This is the second page that's scribed. The third page talks about cloth. 20 cloths with designs, 16 feet by 5 feet each. There's a flower design, there's a rabbit design, there's a reed design. These all mimic actually the Nahuatl calendar, the Nahuatl signs that we actually talked about when we were talking about the Huexotzinco Codex. And then in the middle here, we actually have the numbers. So 460 flower designs, 160 rabbit designs, 120 reed designs. And the manuscript goes on. So we have here 5 cloths of woven red rabbit fur, 4 by 20, 80 mantles for a total of 400 rabbit fur cloths. Again, a strange thing, but this is something that was demanded by the 3 people who had come in ostensibly to actually be the king's and Cortez's representatives in running the region of Huexotzinco and the town. The most important of the pages is this one. And this is an extremely important page for a number of reasons. So when our Indigenous witness is talking about this court case, he says that there were all of these things that you see on this page. Okay, so 8 male slaves sold to pay for the gold, 6 female slaves sold, 6 female slaves sold. They're both dressed differently. 400 loincloths, 60 leather chests, 400 tipped metal darts, 400 pots of liquid amber, 400 small mantles of food for the troops, 3 fine gold plaques for the gold and the Madonna, 9 plumages each containing 20 large green feathers, and this Madonna standard for Guzman, and 21 gold plaques. What we basically see here is that Guzman and his co-conspirators here wanted to march on a neighboring town and basically collected a certain amount of money in order to raise their troops, a certain amount of money in order to buy arms, and an amount of money to create this Madonna standard. In other words, this was a standard that was going to be borne by the troops of the Madonna, so of the Virgin Mary and the Christ child here, in feathers and gold. And this represents the first known representation of the Virgin Mary drawn in the Americas in 1531. So this is an important indigenous page. And so the manuscript really kind of centers around the amount of money and gold that went into actually creating this particular Madonna and this standard. This is talked about by Lucas and all of the other indigenous witnesses in the 79 pages of Spanish text, talking about how this was basically, the money was basically exploited and taken from the indigenous peoples of Huexotzinco, supposedly with the idea that it was going to go to the crown, which it didn't. So Cortez's lawsuit in the manuscript basically reflects the problems associated with doing this and the illegality of this sort of behavior. Another thing that's kind of interesting, really there's two, that is the earliest representation of the Virgin Mary. One of the earliest representations of Christ is found in the San Rafael cave in Santo Domingo in the Dominican Republic from the 16th century. This is also in the Library of Congress collections. This is part of the Kislak collection. So the Library of Congress has both what is thought to be perhaps the earliest Christ figure created in the New World, and also the earliest representation of the Virgin Mary in the Harkness Huexotzinco Codex. Now, the other pages talk a little bit more detail about the actual raising of the troops. And basically, we see two different Nahuatl leaders here, each with various symbolic shields, which basically tell of their family line. And we basically have a symbol on the right-hand side here saying that 11 family lineages contributed warriors to what was actually going to happen, what Guzman and his compatriots were attempting to hatch here in Cortez's absence. And so the lawsuit really is coming to pushing all of the things that basically took place after Cortez left, and that these three judges and overseers of the town began to exploit the town people. It's also told that the indigenous granary, which held maize for future use, was also used in order to raise money for not only the Madonna, but also for the troops who were going to wage war on a neighboring town. It tells us that 10 different household lineages contributed maize to this project. The thing that's amazing about it, and this is the last page of the manuscript, is the sheer number of things that we are talking about here, the sheer volume of tribute and exploitation that was taking place. On this last particular page, some things are kind of summed up about what was actually exploited. And we're talking here about 8,000 turkeys, 48,000 chili peppers, 32,000 ears of corn. So large amounts of tribute that are being exploited or taken from both what should have gone to the crown and also what it should have gone partially to Cortez, as opposed to being used for Guzman and his compatriots' plans and their personal use. So what we're really seeing here is kind of a fascinating document. So we are in 1531. We are talking about a group of people who were allies with Cortez in the overthrow of Montezuma and the takeover of the region in the Valley of Mexico down through Huexotzinco and the rest of Mexico. But they were allies with Cortez. And we're seeing that in Cortez's absence, the representatives who are supposed to be taking over for him and basically helping running this are basically exploiting the indigenous peoples. And so what we're really seeing here is we're seeing a lawsuit that Cortez is bringing against them in a Spanish court in order to recover some of this, in order to, in fact, show how the indigenous peoples are being exploited. So the document itself is an amazing piece of history. Not only is it on beautiful amate and beautifully done paper, but it is a document which goes step by step through indigenous testimony with figures such as this in Nahuatl, which would have been understandable to many of the Nahuatl people who were involved in this case, showing graphically the exploitation of this particular group of people and the crimes of Guzman. And in the sense, it is an amazing window into the very earliest interactions between the indigenous peoples in towns like Huexotzinco and the Spanish crown and Spanish law. And for that reason, it is one of the most important documents in the library's collection. We've talked here about 3 documents: the Oztoticpac Lands Map, the Codex or Mappa Quetzalecatzin, and the Huexotzinco Codex. These are the only 3 Mesoamerican indigenous documents in the library's collection, and their importance can't really be overestimated. And so in doing the seminar and in kind of putting it forward, my thought was to kind of show and highlight those pieces in a way that maybe they haven't been highlighted before, to kind of talk about some of the intricacies of them and some of the symbolism that we see in them. None of them have been researched enough. They all could use more scholarly attention. But that's kind of really what I wanted to kind of present in the seminars and kind of put out there in a way for an audience that might not know that these particular pieces existed, and kind of how these documents are actually put together. So I really want to thank everyone who was here for any of them, 1, 2, or 3, or the whole set. And I wanted to kind of thank the Rare Book School for kind of putting this together. So as I said, it's been kind of an amazing time. So I'd be happy to take any questions that you have. And thank you all for being here.
All right, John, to start off with, we have a question that is actually left over from last time, but still relevant. So this questioner is wondering about the prevalence of manuscript production in the region and who is responsible for manuscript creation, such as were there scriptoria or the like, and how widespread was it?
Well, that's an interesting question. So there's a couple of things we can say about that. So if we talk about Nahuatl manuscripts such as this, the Aztecs and Nahuatl were extremely, let's say, bureaucratic. So there's quite a number of documents that survive from the post-contact period, especially in Nahua when transcriptions into Roman script began to take place. So there are quite a few post-contact Nahua documents. Pre-contact Nahua documents are a different story. There are very few. When we're talking about Mesoamerica as kind of a region, when we talk about, say, Maya documents, there are only 4 pre-contact Maya documents that survive. All total, there is less than 30 or 35. There's some dispute on a few of them, pre-contact Mesoamerican documents that survive. In the case of the Maya, there's only 4 books that in fact survive, all on a mate, all on the paper that we're kind of talking about here. There's the thing called the Grolier Codex, the Dresden Codex, the Paris Codex, what we see in those documents is the sort of final survivals, the only survivals of Maya writing in a book, and there are only 4, as I said. Those are extremely important, extremely rare. Those are obviously done by very gifted artists and very gifted scribes. We do believe in the Maya case that there were scriptoriums. We see the evidence of that on things like vases and other inscriptions. In the case of the Nahua, we have the same thing. We only have in the 20s of pre-conquest actual documents. Most of the ones that survive are really beautifully done, beautifully painted by scribes and artists. In the case of the post-contact period pieces, things like the Oztoticpac Lands Map, the Codex Quetzalecatzin, and these are obviously done by scribes. There's this interaction between the sort of indigenous language and the actual Spanish that's being written. And so during the post-contact period, especially in the period of, say, the Huexotzinco Codex here, we have a lot of Nahua scribes and former Nahua scribes being kind of trained in rewriting in Roman scripts. So to answer your question, yes, there are definitely scriptoriums. These are usually attached to either law courts or bureaucracies in the sense of the Aztecs. Most of the pre-conquest stuff have a certain amount of calendrics to them, so they're calendars, divine or divinity pieces. In the case of the Maya books, and we think about things like the Madrid Codex, simply because of the accidental survival, we have things like beekeeping manuals and deer hunting manuals. In the case of the Dresden Codex, we have Venus almanacs and things like that, mostly calendrics. So we only have the smallest smattering of what was probably an extremely active and very, very important book production and manuscript production culture.
All right, our next question is, are traditional painting and drawing methods also preserved along with the paper making? And do we know what brushes or tools were used to apply the ink?
There are some people who have studied quite a bit of that. We also know a lot about the colors and the pigments themselves, especially in the case of Nahua manuscripts where we have actually some post-contact information. In the sense of the Maya manuscripts, we don't have really much at all to go on. We do know basically because they're pictured, the scribes are pictured, the kind of things they were used. We also have, in the case of the Maya, some archaeological evidence where we've actually have some paint brushes and things like that, which have been found in archaeological evidence. In the case of the Nahua, we're a lot more on firmer ground, simply because the Nahua language and the symbolism was never really forgotten. It never disappeared the way the Maya did, needing to then be redeciphered. So we do have a sense of what they used and how they used it. There have been some people who've worked on especially things like the Florentine Codex, which is not a traditional or not a manuscript that was done pre-contact, but post-contact. People have studied the paints and the methodologies, and also things like there's groups of manuscripts. There's something called the Borgia group and a few other groups of Mesoamerican manuscripts that have been studied quite heavily. So we do have some sense of that. There's a really good book just recently released on the Nettle Codex, which is called the Complete Nettle Codex, which kind of really goes into the kind of production of some of the more beautiful examples of Mixtec and Nahuatl manuscripts. So I would suggest that if you're really interested.
Along the same lines, we have a question about what the inks and dyes of this codex were made of.
Well, that's a good question. To answer it succinctly off the top of my head, I can't tell you. But there have been studies done on it. One of the conservators of the Library of Congress, his name is Betsy Howd, has spent a great deal of time, and you should just Google her name, Betsy Howd, and Mesoamerican pigments or colors. And there's a paper that she wrote, which is available online, which really goes into detail about some of the dyes and some of the pigments that are used in these manuscripts. Obviously, there are things like cochineal, so the classic red derived from the scale bugs on cacti. Maya blue, of course, is very important, which is indigo mixed with polygorskite clay. Yellows are much more difficult to determine, but I would suggest looking at that work and her work on color. And there's also a book, there's a reading list that I actually, it goes along with this, which there's a short little book called Colors of the Florentine Codex, which would give you a really good introduction to the colors used on these kinds of manuscripts and what we know of the dyes and pigments and how they were made.
Could you please repeat the citation you gave for the Maya dyes and pigments?
That would be basically it's Betsy Howd, H-A-U-D-E, and she wrote a paper several years ago, which is in I believe the Annals of the American Conservation. But if you Google her along with the word pigment and color, you'll get her paper, and it's a very comprehensive look at this of the Florentine Codex, and that book is a short little book which will give you a real deep dive into the colors used in that codex and several others.
All right, and one last question for the evening. Do you know if any artists are using the paper that's being made in Mexico today?
There are lots of people using the paper. You can buy the paper online. The paper is made in various forms. You can get it in various colors. There's a whole series of actual villages and towns in Mexico which really specialize in making really high quality versions of this paper. So there are lots of people who are using the paper today, just like all of the handmade paper that seems to be out there at this point. But yes, there are many artists and many people using the paper. The paper is also was used ritually. It was used to make these little kind of figurines, which were then burned ritually. That's still done in people practicing certain indigenous traditional rituals. So there is still a great deal of use of the paper in Mexico. And so I guess that's it. So I guess that's the end of the 3 sessions. Like I said, I want to again thank everyone who participated in any of them. I want to thank you for all your questions and your interest. And I really want to thank the Rare Book School who through these very difficult times is really trying to keep the faith and at least keep us somehow centered on some of the things that before all the madness we thought were very important. So I really want to thank the staff of the Rare Book School and everything they do. Their support, everyone should support them. And like I said, I want to thank all of you for participating and for the great questions. So everyone should stay safe, and I look forward to doing this again sometime. Thank you very much.